The Galactic Concord had stood for 12,000 years, a massive alliance of 132 alien species that controlled trade, territory, and law across the Orion arm of the galaxy. And in all that time, no species had ever joined its ranks with less ceremony than humanity. They came not with warships or demands, but with open hands and wide eyes, asking only for a chance to sit at the table, and the council gave them the smallest chair in the room. That was 40 years ago. Humanity had proven itself useful since then. They were clever engineers, tireless workers, and surprisingly adaptable to the thousands of different alien cultures they encountered across the stars. But to the older species, the ones who had ruled for millennia, humans were still nothing more than children playing dress-up in a galaxy they did not understand. Ambassador Elias Nyeru knew this better than anyone. He had spent 15 years as humanity's voice in the Concord Senate, and in all that time, he had learned one lesson above all others. Patience was not just a virtue among the stars, it was a weapon, and he wielded it with absolute precision. On this particular morning, Nijeru stood at the speaker's platform, in the center of the Great Senate Hall, on the Concord capital world of Thisara Prime. The hall was enormous, a cathedral of crystal and light that could seat representatives from every member species. Thousands of alien faces looked down at him from tiered balconies that rose so high they disappeared into the glowing mist above. He was the smallest person in the room, and he knew it. "Honored members of the Concord," Nijeru began, his voice calm and steady, amplified by the translation systems that turned his words into 100 alien languages. "I come before you today with a simple request: fairness." He paused, letting the words settle across the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. "Humanity has been a loyal member of this body for 4 decades. We have followed every law, honored every treaty, and contributed to every joint defense initiative we have been asked to support. And yet our colony worlds remain restricted to the outer rim. Our trade routes are the longest and most dangerous in Concord space, and our requests for resource allocation have been denied 17 times in the last 8 years alone." He looked up at the High Council balcony, where the 12 most powerful beings in the galaxy sat in their ornate seats, watching him with expressions that ranged from boredom to open contempt. "We do not ask for special treatment," Nijeru continued. "We ask only for the same rights and opportunities granted to every other species in this chamber. Nothing more, nothing less." For a moment, the Senate Hall was silent, and Nijeru allowed himself to hope that perhaps this time his words had reached them. Then Councillor Zaelvreth stood up. Zaelvreth was a Velkari, an insectoid species that stood nearly 3 meters tall, with a chitinous exoskeleton of deep black and mandibles that clicked when he was annoyed. And right now, they were clicking very loudly. The Velkari were one of the founding species of the Concord, and Zaelvreth had sat on the High Council for over 200 years. He considered himself the guardian of galactic order, and he considered humanity a stain on that order. "The human ambassador speaks of fairness," Zaelvreth said, his translated voice dripping with amusement. "How touching. A species that has existed for the blink of an eye demands to be treated as equals by civilizations that were building star empires before humans had learned to use fire." Laughter rippled through the Senate, not from everyone, but from enough to make the point. Zaelvreth leaned forward, his 4 compound eyes fixed on Jeru. "You are short-lived vermin playing at civilization," he said, "and the fact that we allow you to stand in this chamber at all is a generosity you clearly do not appreciate. Your petition is denied. Again." The laughter grew louder. Nijeru stood perfectly still at the podium. He did not flinch, did not raise his voice, did not clench his fists. He simply waited until the noise faded, and then he smiled, a small, quiet smile that did not reach his eyes. "I thank the counselor for his candor," Nijeru said, "and I want to assure this body that humanity's commitment to the Concord remains unchanged. We will continue to be patient. He stepped down from the platform and walked out of the chamber with his back straight and his head held high, and not a single person in that room understood the warning hidden in those last 4 words. Not a single one. On the far side of Concord space, 17,000 light-years from the Senate Hall, the human border colony of Elysium 4 orbited a warm yellow star that reminded its settlers of home. It was not the richest world humanity had been given. The Council had made sure of that. But in the 40 years since its founding, the people of Elysium 4 had turned it into something beautiful. The colony held 2.3 million people, spread across 3 continents of green forests, blue rivers, and golden farmland. There were cities with tall buildings and parks full of trees imported from Earth. There were factories and research labs and hospitals. And there were schools, dozens of schools filled with children who had been born under an alien sun, but who still sang the old songs and told the old stories of a small blue world they had never seen. Captain Dara Okonkwo sat in her quarters aboard the UENS Defiant, a human destroyer assigned to patrol the space around Elysium 4. She was a tall woman with dark skin and sharp eyes, and she had served in the United Earth Navy for 22 years, long enough to know that the galaxy was not as peaceful as the Concord pretended it was. Right now, though, she was not thinking about the galaxy. She was watching a holoscreen that showed a shaky recording of a school play happening on the surface below. Her daughter, Amara, was playing the part of a tree in some children's story, standing very still with her arms stretched out like branches, while other children danced around her. Okonkwo smiled. Her first officer, Lieutenant Commander Reese, knocked on the door and stepped inside. "Captain, we have received the summary of today's Senate session." "And?" Okonkwo asked, without looking away from the screen. "Ambassador Njeru's petition was denied. Councillor Zaelvreth called us vermin. Again." Okonkwo nodded slowly. She had expected nothing different. "None of them did any more. Anything else?" "No, ma'am. Same as always." Okonkwo turned off the holoscreen and stood up, looking out the viewport at the blue-green curve of Elysium 4 below. From up here, it looked so peaceful, a jewel of life hanging in the darkness, filled with people who just wanted to live and grow and raise their families in peace. "Same as always," she repeated quietly. But something in the back of her mind, that instinct she had developed over 2 decades of service, told her that things were not going to stay the same for much longer. There was something in the air, something in the way the Council had been looking at humanity lately, that made her uneasy. She pushed the feeling aside and went back to work, because that was what humans did. They endured, they adapted, and they kept going, no matter how many times the galaxy tried to push them down. On Thesara Prime, Nejeru returned to the human embassy and sat alone in his office. The lights were dim, and the room was quiet. He poured himself a glass of water and stared at the far wall for a long time. His aide, a young woman named Priya, found him there an hour later. "Ambassador, are you all right?" Nejeru looked at her and smiled, that same small smile he had given the Senate. "I am fine, Priya. I am always fine." "The things Zaelvreth said are nothing I have not heard before," Nejeru said, "and they are nothing I will not hear again. This is the game we play. We smile, we bow, we endure, and we wait." Priya hesitated. "Wait for what, sir?" Nejeru took a long drink of water and set the glass down gently. "For them to make a mistake," he said, "because they will. They always do. Every empire that has ever looked at someone smaller and seen weakness instead of patience has eventually learned the same lesson. And when the Council learns that lesson, I want us to be ready." He stood up and straightened his jacket. "Go home, Priya. Get some rest. Tomorrow we try again." She nodded and left, and Nejeru stood alone in the quiet room, staring at the stars through the window, thinking about 2.3 million people on a world called Elysium, living their lives in the shadow of a galaxy that did not respect them. He would protect them, because patience was not weakness, it was a choice. And every choice had a limit. The question was not whether the council would cross that limit. The question was when. 3 weeks after Ambassador Nejiro's petition was denied on the Senate floor, the High Council of 12 gathered in a chamber that did not officially exist. It was buried deep beneath the Senate Hall on Thesara Prime, behind doors that required the biometric signature of at least 7 council members to open. And the room itself was shielded against every known form of surveillance in the galaxy. This was where the real decisions were made. Not in the grand theater of the Senate, but in this cold, dark room where 12 beings decided the fate of civilizations without anyone watching. Counselor Zale Vreth stood at the head of the long table, his black exoskeleton gleaming under the pale blue lights. He had called this meeting, and he had come prepared. Humanity is a problem, he said, his mandibles clicking with each word. And it is a problem that grows worse with every passing year. He activated a holographic display above the table, and it filled the room with data, charts, projections, population growth curves, technological development timelines, and trade influence maps that showed humanity's reach spreading across the Concord like roots through soil. In 40 years, they have expanded to 73 colony worlds. Their population has grown to 19 billion across all settlements. Their technological advancement rate is 3 times faster than any other junior species in Concord history. And most concerning of all, he swiped the display to show a new set of data. 14 junior species have begun adopting human cultural practices, trade methods, and even military doctrines. He turned to face the other 11 council members. They are not just growing, they are influencing. And if we do not act now, within a century they will have enough allies and enough power to challenge this council directly. Several council members murmured in agreement. The fear was real. Humanity was doing something no junior species had ever done before. They were making friends, and friends meant power. Only one voice rose in opposition. "This is madness," said Councillor Iria Solemnis, her crystalline body flickering with pale light as she spoke. She was an Athen, a species made of living mineral that could live for thousands of years. And she was one of the oldest beings on the council. Humanity has broken no laws. They have threatened no one. What you are describing is not a security concern. It is jealousy. Zaelvreth hissed, his mandibles snapping shut. "It is survival," he said, "and I have a solution." He pulled up an ancient document on the display, a piece of Concord law so old that most species had forgotten it existed. It was called Directive 7 Omega, and it had been written in the early days of the Concord as a tool to control species that expanded too quickly. The directive allowed the High Council to reclaim colony worlds from any junior species if those worlds were deemed to be inefficiently utilized. "We invoke the directive on Elysium 4, Zaelvreth said. "It is their most prominent border colony. Taking it sends a message. We relocate the population to the Kasara moon system and redistribute the planet's resources among council species." "Relocate 2.3 million people?" Solemnus said, her light flaring with anger. "To Kasara? That system has no breathable atmosphere. It is a wasteland." "It is adequate," Zaelvreth replied coldly. "And if the humans resist?" Zaelvreth paused for just a moment. "Then we will use necessary force." The vote was called. 9 council members voted in favor of Directive 7 Omega. 3 voted against, including Solemnus, who stood from her seat and fixed Zaelvreth with a stare that burned like white fire. "You do not understand what you are provoking," she said. "I understand perfectly," Zaelvreth replied. "I am putting vermin in their place." 1 week later, a Valkyrie enforcement fleet of 200 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the space above Elysium 4. They came without warning, without negotiation, and without mercy. 200 ships arranged in a perfect blockade formation around a world of families and farms and schools. Captain Dara Okonkwo was on the bridge of the UNES Defiant when the alarms began screaming. "Captain," Lieutenant Commander Reese shouted from his station, "we have multiple FTL signatures, hundreds of them. They are Valkyrie." Okonkwo was on her feet in an instant, staring at the tactical display as red dots flooded the screen like a swarm of angry insects surrounding her tiny blue triangle. She had 1 destroyer and 2 frigates. 3 ships against 200. "Open a channel to the lead vessel," she ordered. The screen flickered, and the face of a Valkyrie fleet commander appeared, a scarred, battle-hardened insectoid who looked at Okonkwo the way someone might look at a fly on their dinner table. "Human vessel, this is Fleet Commander Vrakis of the Valkyrie Enforcement Division. By order of the High Council under Directive 7 Omega, the colony designated Elysium 4 has been reclaimed. All human inhabitants have 6 hours to evacuate to designated transport vessels. Failure to comply will be met with necessary force. This is not a negotiation." The transmission ended. Okonkwo stared at the blank screen. 6 hours. 6 hours to move 2.3 million people. It was impossible. This was not an evacuation order. It was an excuse. "Get me a direct line to Earth Command," Okonkwo said, her voice steady, even as her hands trembled. "And get me the colonial governor on the surface, now." The next 6 hours were chaos. On the surface, the governor tried to organize an evacuation, but there were not enough ships, not enough time, and not enough room. People filled the streets, carrying children and whatever they could hold. The spaceports were overwhelmed within the first hour. Families were separated. Elderly people collapsed in the crush. And through it all, the shadow of the Valkyrie fleet hung above them like a death sentence. Okonkwo did everything she could. She broadcast repeated requests for more time on every frequency. She begged. She reasoned. She cited every Concord law she could think of. And Fleet Commander Vrakis ignored every single one. When the 6 hours expired, less than 40,000 people had made it off the surface. "Time is up," Vrakis announced on the open channel. "Commence compliance operations." The first plasma bombardment hit the outer residential district of New Helsinki, a neighborhood of apartment buildings, small shops, and a community park where children had been playing just hours before. The blast turned everything within a 2-kilometer radius into fire and ash in less than 3 seconds. Then the second blast came, and the third, and the fourth. Okonkwo watched from orbit as sections of the planet below lit up with orange fire, and the screaming on the communication channels was something she would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. "They are hitting civilian zones," Reese yelled, his face white with shock. "Residential areas, hospitals. Captain, they just hit the Eastern School Complex." The Eastern School Complex. Okonkwo felt something inside her chest crack open, like glass breaking in slow motion. Amara's school was in the Eastern District, the same school where her daughter had played a tree in that silly play. The same school where Amara had made her first friends, lost her first tooth, and learned to read. "Amara," she whispered. But there was no time for grief. The Valkyrie were still firing, and people were still dying. "All hands, battle stations," Okonkwo commanded, and her voice was not shaking anymore. It was something else entirely. Something cold and hard and terrifying. "Target the nearest Valkyrie vessel and fire everything we have. If we are going to die today, we are going to die fighting." The Defiant surged forward, and her 2 escort frigates followed. 3 tiny ships against an armada. It was suicide, and every person on those ships knew it, and not one of them hesitated. They fought for 47 minutes before the Defiant was crippled, its engines destroyed and its hull torn open. The frigates were gone, one destroyed, one drifting lifeless in the void. Okonkwo lay on the bridge floor, with blood running down her face, surrounded by the bodies of her crew, and she pulled herself to the communications console with hands that were burned and broken. She activated the emergency distress beacon, the one that broadcast directly to Earth on a quantum-encrypted channel that could not be blocked or intercepted. And she spoke the words that would change the galaxy forever. "This is Captain Dara Okonkwo of the UENS Defiant to Earth Command. Elysium 4 is under attack. The Velkari are bombarding civilian targets. Over 140,000 confirmed dead. They are killing us. They are killing children. Send everyone." She did not know if anyone heard her. She did not know if it mattered. But the message went out at the speed of light across the quantum network, and within minutes it reached Earth, and within minutes after that, it was broadcast on every screen, every speaker, and every device on every single human world in the galaxy. 19 billion people heard Dara Okonkwo's voice break as she said the words, "They are killing children." And something fundamental shifted in the soul of the human species. On Thessera Prime, Counselor Solemnis sat alone in her chamber and watched the reports come in from Elysium 4, and her ancient crystalline body dimmed until she was barely glowing at all. "What have you done?" she whispered to no one. "What have you done?" Across human space, the grief came first, a wave of horror and sorrow that swept over every colony, every station, every ship. People held their children and wept, strangers embraced in the streets. Vigils were held in every city, on every world. But grief has a half-life, and what it decays into is something far more dangerous. Within hours, the sorrow began to harden, and the tears began to dry. And in the silence that followed, humanity did not scream, or rage, or cry out for vengeance. It simply went quiet. And the galaxy had never heard anything so terrifying in all its 12,000 years of recorded history. On the morning after the bombardment of Elysium 4, every human embassy in Concord space closed its doors at exactly the same moment. There was no announcement, no press statement, no angry declaration. The lights simply went off. The staff walked out, and the doors locked behind them. Ambassador Elias Nigeru was the last to leave. He stood in the Concord Senate chamber one final time, surrounded by hundreds of alien representatives who watched him in uneasy silence. They expected him to shout, to threaten, to make demands. That was what species did when they were hurt. They made noise. Nigeru made no noise at all. He looked up at the High Council balcony, where Zyovret sat watching him with those 4 compound eyes, and he held that gaze for a long, terrible moment. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber, without saying a single word. The doors closed behind him, and that was the last time any alien species heard from a human diplomat for 11 days. The silence spread like a virus. Human trade ships stopped arriving at Concord ports. Human communication relays went dark. Human military vessels vanished from their patrol routes as if they had never existed. The entire human presence in the galaxy simply disappeared overnight. And the void they left behind was filled with a fear that grew worse with every hour that passed. On Thessera Prime, the Concord Senate dissolved into panic. Junior species who had always looked up to humanity demanded answers from the Council. Trade networks that depended on human shipping began to collapse, and rumors spread through every bar, market, and back channel in the galaxy. The humans were coming. The humans were planning something. The humans had weapons nobody had ever seen. Some of the rumors were wrong. Most of them were not. On Earth, in a bunker buried 2 kilometers beneath the Swiss Alps, the United Earth Parliament convened an emergency session. The chamber was full. Every senator, every representative, every military advisor, And on the wall behind the speaker's podium, a single screen played the footage from Elysium 4, on a continuous loop. The burning districts, the crumbling buildings, the silence of neighborhoods that had been full of life just hours before. The Speaker of Parliament, a woman named Ades Mwangi, stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled leaders of the human race. She did not need to give a speech. The footage spoke for itself. The motion before this body is to invoke total war footing under Article 7 of the United Earth Charter, she said. All in favor? Every hand in the chamber went up. Every single one. It was the first unanimous vote in the Parliament's 200-year history. And when it was recorded, nobody cheered. They simply nodded and went to work, because there was much to be done and very little time to do it. Within the hour, Admiral Rena Voss was summoned to the command center beneath the Alps and given supreme military authority under a contingency plan called Protocol Prometheus. Very few people in the galaxy knew about Protocol Prometheus, and that was exactly the point. When humanity had first joined the Concorde 4 decades ago, the founders of the United Earth Government had looked at the galaxy and seen it clearly for what it was. Not a community of equals, but a hierarchy of predators wearing the mask of civilization. They smiled and shook hands and signed treaties, but behind closed doors, every species was watching every other species for signs of weakness, and the strong devoured the weak whenever they thought no one was looking. The founders had understood that humanity would be tested, and they had prepared accordingly. For 40 years, while human diplomats smiled and bowed and endured insults on the Senate floor, human engineers had been building in secret, deep in asteroid fields and hidden within nebulae that the Concorde sensors could not penetrate. Humanity had constructed shipyards, research stations, and weapons laboratories that did not appear on any official record. The fleet that humanity had shown the Concorde, a modest force of a few hundred patrol ships, was a mask. Behind it lay the true face of human military power. And when Admiral Voss activated Protocol Prometheus, that mask finally came off. 3,700 warships. That was the number that appeared on the displays in the command center. 3,700 vessels of every class, from nimble corvettes to massive dreadnoughts, all built in secret over 4 decades and crewed by personnel who had trained for a war they hoped would never come. But the ships were only part of it. There were the autonomous drone swarms, millions of small, intelligent combat units that could overwhelm an enemy fleet like a cloud of steel hornets. There were the stealth frigates, equipped with cloaking technology that the Concorde did not even know was possible. There were the cyber warfare systems, capable of shutting down an enemy's communications and navigation in seconds. And then there was the Aegis Lance. The Aegis Lance was a concentrated graviton beam weapon mounted on 12 specialized capital ships. It worked by focusing gravitational energy into a single, devastating pulse that could tear through any known shield technology and rip a warship apart at the molecular level. In theory, it could crack the crust of a planet. But humanity had designed it for ships, because even in their darkest hour, they drew a line they would not cross. Admiral Voss stood in the command center and studied the holographic display of the galaxy, her face calm and composed as officers moved around her in organized urgency. She was 57 years old, and she had spent her entire adult life preparing for exactly this moment. The moment when patience was no longer enough. "Status report," she said. "All fleet groups report combat ready, Admiral," her chief of staff replied. "The 3rd, 5th, and 7th Expeditionary Fleets are positioned for immediate deployment to Elysium 4. The 1st and 9th Strike Groups are standing by for secondary operations against Council military infrastructure. Drone swarms are online and awaiting targeting data." Voss nodded. "And the Velkari fleet at Elysium 4? "Still in orbit, Admiral. 200 ships maintaining blockade formation. They appear to have begun ground occupation of the surviving colony districts. Voss was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that would later become famous across the galaxy. They brought 200 ships to murder civilians. Let us show them what a real fleet looks like. On the far side of the galaxy, Counselor Iria Solemnis sat in her private quarters and composed a message on an encrypted channel she had never used before. A channel that connected directly to the human embassy network. She did not know if anyone would receive it, but she had to try. Ambassador Neru, she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. I know you have every reason to ignore me. I know that my words mean very little against the weight of what has been done. But I am begging you, please, there must be another way. War will consume everything. The response came 12 hours later, and it was not from Nachuru's diplomatic office. It was from his personal channel, which meant he had read her message himself. Counselor Solemnis, the message read, there was another way. There were many other ways, and humanity offered every single one of them. We came to your concord with open hands, and your council cut them off. There was a way when we asked for fairness, and were called vermin. There was a way when we filed our petitions, and were laughed at. There was a way right up until the moment your council decided to murder 140,000 of our people, including our children. That was the way, Counselor, and your council destroyed it. I am sorry, but what comes next is no longer in my hands. Solemnis read the message 3 times, and each time, the light inside her crystalline body grew dimmer. On the surface of Elysium 4, in the ruins of what had once been the city of New Helsinki, Captain Dara Okonkwo pulled herself out of the wreckage of a collapsed building. Her left arm was broken, her uniform was soaked with blood that was partly hers and partly not, and every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. But she was alive, and she had work to do. She limped through the shattered streets, stepping over rubble and debris, until she reached the Eastern District, or what was left of it. The entire block was a crater of melted glass and scorched earth, and there was nothing left to find. She stood at the edge of that crater for a long time, looking down at the place where her daughter had learned to read and write and laugh, and she felt something inside her settle into place like a key turning in a lock. Not rage, not grief, but something deeper and quieter and infinitely more dangerous. Purpose. She turned away from the crater and activated her emergency communicator. The signal was weak, but it reached the surviving militia units scattered across the continent. This is Captain Okonkwo, to all surviving forces. I am assuming field command. Our people are still alive down here, and the Velkari are moving ground troops into the remaining districts. We are outgunned, outnumbered, and alone, but help is coming. I do not know when, but I know it is coming, because I know my people, and they do not leave their own behind. She paused and looked up at the sky, where the dark shapes of Velkari warships hung like vultures. Hold the line, she said. Hold the line, and make them pay for every single step. Across the ruins of Elysium 4, scattered groups of survivors, soldiers, police officers, farmers, teachers, ordinary people who had never held a weapon before, heard her voice and stood up, and they held the line. On the Velkari flagship in orbit, Fleet Commander Vrakis received an intelligence report from his scouts in nearby systems. There were unusual energy signatures near the human border, massive FTL distortions that suggested fleet movements on a scale the Velkari had never seen from humanity before. He forwarded the report to Counselor Zalvreth on Visara Prime. Zalvreth read the report and dismissed it with a flick of his clawed hand. What can they do? He said to his aide. They are insects. They have a few hundred patrol ships and the courage of desperation. Let them come. We will crush them as easily as we crush their colony. His aide hesitated. Counselor, our intelligence on human military capabilities is 40 years old. We have never actually verified. Because there is nothing to verify, Zalvreth snapped. They are primitives, with delusions of grandeur. Stop wasting my time. The aide bowed and left, and Zalvreth turned back to his work, completely certain that he had the situation under control. He was wrong. He was so terribly, catastrophically wrong, and in the cold silence of human space, 3,700 warships were powering up their engines, and 19 billion voices were united in a single wordless promise. You killed our children. We are coming. Fleet Commander Vrakis was drinking his third cup of stimulant tea on the bridge of the Velkari flagship Endless Dominion, when his sensor officer made a sound he had never heard a Velkari make before, a high-pitched whine of pure animal terror. "Commander," the officer said, and his voice was shaking so badly the words barely came out. "FTL signatures, multiple contacts. Commander, this cannot be right." Vrakis set down his tea. "Report properly, officer." 3,000 contacts, sir. 3,000 warships dropping out of FTL in a sphere formation around our position. They are everywhere. The bridge went silent. Vrakis walked to the main viewport and looked out into the void above Elysium 4. And what he saw turned his ichor cold. The blackness of space was splitting open in every direction, torn apart by the blue-white flashes of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ships arriving at once, not in a scattered, disorganized rush, but in perfect geometric formation, like the petals of a terrible flower opening around his fleet. They were human ships, and there were so many of them that they blotted out the stars. The 3rd, 5th, and 7th Expeditionary Fleets of the United Earth Navy had arrived at Elysium 4, and at their center, like a sword pointed at the heart of the Velkari blockade, was the dreadnought UENS Prometheus, the flagship of Admiral Renavas. Every communication channel in the system crackled to life at the same moment, and Admiral Voss's voice filled every bridge, every cockpit, and every command center for 1,000,000 kilometers in every direction. This is Admiral Renavas of the United Earth Navy to all Velkari vessels in the Elysium system. 11 days ago, you opened fire on a civilian population of 2.3 million people. You killed 140,000 men, women, and children who had committed no crime and posed no threat. You bombed their homes, their hospitals, and their schools. You did this under the authority of a council that called us vermin and assumed we would do nothing. She paused, and in that pause, 3,000 weapon systems locked on to the Velkari fleet simultaneously. You were wrong. You have 60 seconds to power down your weapons and surrender unconditionally. This offer will not be repeated. On the bridge of the Endless Dominion, Vrakis stared at the tactical display. 3,000 red contacts surrounding his 200 ships like wolves around a wounded animal. And he felt something he had never felt before in his 2-century career. Fear. But he was Velkari, and the Velkari did not surrender, especially not to species they considered beneath them. His pride was older than his fear, and it made his decision for him. "All ships, attack formation," he commanded. "Target the human flagship and fire at will. Show these animals what happens when they challenge their betters." The Velkari fleet surged forward, 200 ships firing every weapon they had at the wall of human vessels surrounding them. The battle lasted 11 minutes. It was a demonstration. The human fleet moved with a coordination that the Velkari had never seen before. Thousands of ships acting as one organism, guided by adaptive artificial intelligence systems that processed tactical data faster than any living mind could follow. Human destroyers peeled apart the Velkari formation with surgical precision, while drone swarms poured into the gaps like rivers of fire, overwhelming point defenses and tearing apart hull plating with relentless efficiency. And then the Aegis lances fired. 12 beams of concentrated gravitational force sliced through the heart of the Velkari fleet, like white-hot knives through paper. Each beam hit a capital ship, and simply erased it. There was no explosion, no dramatic fireball, just a terrible ripple in space as the target was compressed into nothing by forces that crushed matter itself. In 11 minutes, the entire Valkyrie enforcement fleet was destroyed. 187 ships turned to debris and dust, with the remaining 13 drifting lifeless and crippled in the void. The endless Dominion was among the crippled, its engines dead and its weapons silent. Humanity did not lose a single capital ship. On the bridge of the Prometheus, Admiral Voss watched the tactical display clear and felt no satisfaction, only the grim weight of necessity. "Search and rescue operations for Valkyrie survivors," she ordered. "Pick up every escape pod and treat every wounded enemy combatant with full medical care. They are prisoners of war, not targets." Her officers carried out the orders without question, because even in the heat of battle, humanity remembered what it was fighting for, and it was not revenge. It was something harder and more important than revenge. But the war was far from over. Within hours of the Battle of Elysium 4, human strike forces appeared at 18 different locations across Concord space. Not at civilian worlds, not at population centers, but at military shipyards, weapons depots, sensor arrays, and communication relay stations belonging to the 9 council species that had voted for Directive 7 Omega. The attacks were devastatingly precise. Each target was neutralized with minimal casualties and maximum strategic impact. Supply lines were severed, communication networks went dark, and the military infrastructure that the Council had spent centuries building was dismantled piece by piece in a single coordinated operation. And at every target, before the first shot was fired, a human broadcast was transmitted on all frequencies with the same message: "Evacuate non-combatant personnel. You have 15 minutes. This facility will be destroyed. We do not make war on civilians." The message terrified the galaxy more than the attacks themselves, because it proved something that no one had expected. Humanity was not out of control. They were not raging. They were executing a plan with calm, methodical precision, and the restraint they showed was more frightening than any weapon. They could have targeted cities. They could have bombed homeworlds. They could have repaid the horror of Elysium 4 1,000 times over, and they chose not to. Not because they could not, but because they would not. On Thessera Prime, the Concord Senate erupted into chaos. Species that had been neutral in the conflict now openly turned against the Council. 3 Council-member species, the Aethan, the Dorvani, and the Tessek, formally withdrew from the High Council and declared alliance with Earth. Councilor Solemnis addressed the Senate in a voice that shook with emotion. "I warned you," she said, staring directly at Zaelvreth's empty seat. "I warned you, and you laughed at me, and now the galaxy burns because of your arrogance." But Zaelvreth was not on Thessera Prime anymore. He was aboard a massive warship at the center of the largest fleet the galaxy had ever assembled. 10,000 ships, drawn from every species still loyal to the Council, gathered in the Helix Nebula for a single purpose: to crush humanity once and for all. "They surprised us at Elysium," Zaelvreth told his assembled commanders, "but they cannot sustain this. They are still one species against dozens. We outnumber them, we outgun them, and when we destroy their fleet here today, they will have nothing left. This ends now." The human fleet arrived 3 hours later, 6,000 ships against 10,000, outnumbered but not outmatched. The Battle of the Helix Nebula was the largest space engagement in the recorded history of the galaxy, and it raged for 9 hours across a volume of space so vast that light itself could not cross it in time to show one end what was happening at the other. Admiral Voss commanded from the bridge of the Prometheus, her voice never rising above a conversational tone, even as the ship shuddered under enemy fire. She moved her fleets like a chess master, drawing the council forces into traps, splitting their formations, turning their numerical advantage into a liability as their ships collided with each other in the confusion. The human AI coordination systems proved decisive. While the council fleet relied on dozens of different command structures, speaking dozens of different languages, the human fleet moved as one. Every ship knew where every other ship was, what it was doing, and what it needed to do next. And the result was a level of tactical harmony that the galaxy had never witnessed. By the 6th hour, the council fleet was in retreat. By the 9th hour, it was shattered. Jalvret's flagship was captured intact, its crew surrendering after their engines were disabled by a precision drone strike that killed no one. While the battle raged in space, Captain Okonkwo led the ground liberation of Elysium 4. Human marines dropped from orbit into the occupied districts, fighting street by street and building by building to push back the Valkyrie ground forces that had been terrorizing the surviving population for nearly 2 weeks. Okonkwo fought at the front, moving with a focused intensity that made the soldiers around her both inspired and afraid. She did not shout or scream or rage. She simply advanced, clearing each block with ruthless efficiency, until the last Valkyrie unit on the planet laid down their weapons. When the Valkyrie ground commander was brought before her in restraints, he looked at this small human woman covered in dust and blood, and he asked the question that so many aliens had asked throughout history when they finally understood what they were dealing with. "What are you?" Okonkwo looked at him with eyes that held no hatred, only a sorrow so deep it had no bottom. "A mother," she said, and that was all she needed to say. The war lasted 23 days, from the first human ship's arrival at Elysium 4 to the final surrender of the last Council Loyalist fleet. And when it was over, the galaxy looked at humanity and saw something it had never seen before. A species powerful enough to destroy everything, and disciplined enough to choose not to. Counselor Zaelvreth was brought to Thessara Prime in chains. Not the brutal, heavy chains of a conquered prisoner, but the clean, dignified restraints of a war crimes defendant. Humanity insisted on this distinction, because they were not interested in humiliation. They were interested in justice, and justice required process, evidence, and a trial that the entire galaxy could witness. The trial was held in the Great Senate Hall itself, the same chamber where Zaelvreth had called humanity vermin, and it was broadcast to every inhabited world in the Concord. The prosecution was led by a team of human and alien lawyers who presented the evidence with calm, methodical precision. The secret recordings of the council vote, the orders to bombard civilian targets, the communications showing that Zaelvreth had known the 6-hour evacuation window was impossible and had designed it to fail. Zaelvreth sat in the defendant's chair and watched his own words played back to him. And for the first time in his long life, his mandibles were still. He was not tortured, he was not beaten, he was not paraded through the streets or subjected to any of the indignities that conquered enemies had suffered throughout galactic history. He was given legal representation, allowed to speak in his own defense, and treated with a fairness that confused and disturbed many of the alien species watching, because they could not understand why humanity would show mercy to the being who had murdered their children. Ambassador Nehru answered that question when he returned to the Senate chamber for the first time since walking out in silence weeks before. The hall was packed, every seat filled, every balcony overflowing, and when Jeru stepped up to the speaker's platform, the silence was so complete that the sound of his shoes on the floor echoed off the crystal walls. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago, the lines on his face deeper, the weight on his shoulders heavier, but his eyes were clear and his voice was steady. "Members of the Concord," he began, and the translation systems carried his words to every corner of the galaxy. "I stand before you today not as a conqueror, not as a victor seeking tribute, and not as a representative of a species that wishes to rule. I stand here as a man who is very, very tired." He paused, and the honesty of that simple admission cut through every political barrier in the room. "We came to you with open hands, that is the truth. 40 years ago, when humanity first reached the stars and found that we were not alone, we were filled with wonder and hope. We believed that a galaxy of intelligent species would be a galaxy of cooperation, understanding, and shared purpose. We came to your Concord and asked for nothing more than a seat at the table and a chance to contribute." His voice hardened, just slightly. "And you answered our hope with contempt. You gave us the worst worlds and the longest trade routes. You mocked us on your Senate floor and dismissed our petitions with laughter. We endured this, not because we were weak, but because we believed that patience and good faith would eventually be rewarded. We believed in the promise of this Concord." He looked up at the balcony where the High Council had once sat. The seats were empty now, and they would remain empty forever. "You answered our patience with the blood of our children. 140,000 people, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, teachers, farmers, engineers. People whose only crime was living on a world that your council decided it wanted back. You killed them, and you expected us to do nothing." Nehru straightened his back and lifted his chin. "So hear me now, and hear me clearly. We will not rule you. We will not enslave you. We will not impose our will on your worlds or dictate the terms of your existence. We will not do to you what you did to us, because that is what makes us different. That is the line we will never cross, no matter how much pain you inflict on us. But know this, the era of humanity bowing its head is over. Permanently. We are not your servants, we are not your inferiors, and we are not your vermin. We are your equals, and you will treat us as such, or you will face the consequences. Not of cruelty, but of justice." The Senate chamber was silent for a long time after he finished, and then, starting in the lower tiers and spreading upward like a rising tide, the representatives began to stand. Species after species rose from their seats in a gesture of respect that had not been shown to any speaker in the history of the Concord. Even species that had fought against humanity stood, because they recognized the truth when they heard it. The High Council of 12 was formally dissolved that day, and in its place a new governing body was established, the Galactic Assembly, built on the principle of equal representation for every species, regardless of age, size, or power. There would be no inner circle, no secret chambers, no hidden directives. Every decision would be made in the open, and every voice would carry the same weight. Ambassador Elias Njeru was elected as the first speaker of the Galactic Assembly by a margin so large it was essentially unanimous. When he accepted the position, he made only one promise: "I will listen to every voice in this chamber, especially the smallest ones, because I know what it feels like to be small." The Velkari were not destroyed or subjugated. Their military was restricted under a supervised disarmament agreement, and they were required to pay reparations to Elysium IV over a period of 50 years. Their people were not punished for the crimes of their leaders, because humanity understood something that many older species did not. Collective punishment was the weapon of tyrants, and justice meant holding the guilty accountable while leaving the innocent in peace. Zaelvreth was sentenced by the tribunal to spend the remainder of his natural life on Elysium IV, watching the colony he had tried to destroy be rebuilt. He would see every new building rise, every new garden planted, every new child born in the city he had burned, and he would know every single day that he had failed. It was the most human punishment the galaxy had ever seen. Not death, not torture, but forced witness to the resilience he had tried to crush. On a quiet afternoon, 3 months after the war, Councillor Iria Solemnis, the former counselor, for the title no longer existed, traveled to Elysium 4. She was old now, her crystalline body clouded and dim, and she moved slowly through the memorial that had been built on the site of New Helsinki's Eastern District. The memorial was a simple thing, a wall of names carved into white stone, 140,000 names arranged in alphabetical order, with a garden of earth flowers growing at its base. Solemnis walked along the wall, reading names she could not pronounce in a language she had only recently learned. And when she reached the end, she did something that made every Athon in the galaxy weep. She reached into her own chest and pulled out a small crystal, a piece of her own living body, and placed it at the base of the memorial. In Athon culture, this act was called the sorrow eternal, and it meant that the giver would carry the grief of this place inside them for as long as they lived. Nyeru was there, standing a respectful distance away, and when Solemnis turned to him, her light was barely visible. "I failed to stop them," she said. "I voted against the directive, I warned them, but I did not do enough. I am sorry." Nyeru stepped forward and took her hand, a gesture that required great care, as Athon were fragile, and he held it gently. "You were the only one who tried," he said. "That is not failure. That is courage, and we will never forget it." 6 months later, Captain Dara Okonkwo stood on a hill overlooking the rebuilt Eastern District of New Helsinki. The crater was gone, filled in and planted over, and in its place stood a new school, bright and clean and filled with the sound of children laughing. She watched them through the windows, small figures running between desks, drawing pictures, reading stories aloud to each other. And she thought about a little girl who had once played a tree in a school play, standing very still with her arms stretched out like branches. A tear ran down her face, the first she had allowed herself since the bombardment. And it was not a tear of grief, it was something else. It was the sound of a heart that had been holding itself together with nothing but willpower, finally allowing itself to feel again. She wiped her eyes and smiled, and then she turned and walked away, because there was still work to be done, and a galaxy that needed protecting. On a distant world at the edge of explored space, a young alien species was taking its first tentative steps beyond its own atmosphere. Their ships were crude and slow, their understanding of the universe limited and full of wonder, and they had no idea that the galaxy was vast and old and sometimes very cruel. Their radio telescopes picked up a signal one evening, a transmission from deep space, encoded in mathematical language that any intelligent species could eventually decipher. The scientists worked on it for days, and when they finally cracked the code, the message was simple. You are not alone, and you will never have to fight alone. On Earth, in a small house on the coast of what had once been called Kenya, a retired admiral named Rena Voss sat in a chair by the window and watched the sunset over the Indian Ocean. The broadcast had been her idea, a promise sent into the void for anyone who needed to hear it. And she smiled as she thought about all the small, frightened species out there who might one day pick it up and feel just a little less afraid. The galaxy was not perfect. It never would be. But it was better than it had been, and that was enough. That was always enough. Because humanity had learned something in its long, painful journey from a small blue world to the stars. Something that no amount of power or technology could replace, and no amount of cruelty could destroy. The strongest thing in the universe was not a weapon or a fleet or an empire. It was the decision to be kind when you had every reason not to be. And that was the one thing the Council had never understood about humans. Not their ships, not their weapons, not their numbers, but their stubborn, unbreakable refusal to become the monsters that others tried to make them. That was humanity's fury. That was humanity's gift, and the galaxy would never forget it.